Richard Harris was born in England in 1952. He completed his undergraduate training at Cambridge University in England, then completed a master's degree in geography at Ohio State University and a 1981 PhD at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Most of his teaching career has been spent at McMaster University, where he has completed several books about urban housing and won both Fulbright and Guggenheim fellowships for his work. This 1993 article appeared just after he was promoted to full professor in 1992 and is one of his best-known journal articles. The article is important because it presents an excellent case study of the formation of what we can only describe as a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Toronto, but which was not settled by stereotypical middle-class white-collar commuters. The details of who came to live in this suburb and how they managed to build their homes help us to understand how this suburb fits into the larger picture of a growing metropolis in an urban society.
Considered the model of concentric zones that Ernest Burgess proposed as a way to understand the sorting out of expanding cities based on ethnic differences. In other studies of this ethnic sorting, it became clear that there also has been another dimension to the sorting out of urban populations, the dimension of social class. Despite his focus on ethnic segregation, this class dimension already appeared as a central feature of Burgess's original concentric zone model of Chicago. He thought that the expansion of the city, with construction of newer, bigger housing on the outskirts of existing neighborhoods, gradually drew the better-off residents outward, so that the further out you go through his concentric rings, the higher the social class of the people you encounter. For example, after leaving the central business district and the zone in transition, you first encounter what he called the zone of working men's homes, meaning mostly blue-collar workers and their families. Further out, you encounter the middle class with their white-collar jobs, and finally the elites on their large estates at the outer edge of the metropolitan area. We know that this model was basically a thinly veiled description of Burgess's own city of Chicago. One interesting question to ask concerns just how general this description really is. How well do these concentric zones explain the patterns we see in other cities? Not only U.S. cities in the latter half of the 20th century, but cities in other times and places. Could this pattern of rising social class with distance from the center be just a historical accident specific to 20th century conditions in the United States? After all, that period witnessed the expansion of an industrial economy. We also experienced the arrival of millions of immigrants from ethnic backgrounds dramatically different from the existing population. And the United States, unlike many other countries, was still very thinly settled, with lots of room for cities to spread out and deconcentrate all over the surrounding countryside. In fact, we already know that the gradient of social class in ancient pre-industrial cities actually was the exact opposite of that described by Burgess's concentric zones. The highest classes concentrated at the center, and the lowest classes were relegated to the periphery just inside the city walls, or perhaps even the unprotected territory outside those walls. Comparative historians such as Harris have taken a look at the generalizability of these concentric zones and have come up with some very interesting findings. In this case, Harris takes as his subject the Canadian city of Toronto a little more than 100 years ago. At that time, Toronto was in the midst of its own industrial expansion. A lot of immigrants were arriving, and the city was beginning to deconcentrate and sort itself out. The map shows the central business district taking shape where the rail lines converged on the harbor district, a classic case of the break and transport explanation for why cities appear where they do. Toronto actually may not be the best choice for a comparative contrast with U.S. cities like Chicago, since it had so much in common with them even at that time. But all these similarities, such as location on the same system of inland waterways, the same basic ethnic mix of original settlers, and so on, mean that we certainly ought to expect Burgess's concentric zones to show up here as well as in Chicago, if the model is generalizable at all. Historians like Harris often prefer to study particular settings in great detail rather than skating over the surface of a city on a layer of statistics. In this case, the focus that he has chosen is just one small neighborhood on what was at the time the outermost northern edge of Toronto's urban area. The neighborhood appears on the map he presents as his Figure 1, labeled North Earls Court. He located old property records, correspondence, and a wealth of other documents that enable us to get a very detailed look at this community. For instance, in his second figure, he actually zooms us in so that we can see every individual property lot in the neighborhood. These lots were very small and narrow, just barely wide enough for building a small house. Obviously, there were no setback requirements in effect for this area, and we can even see each individual house that had been built at the time the map was made. If you visit the property assessor's office in any U.S. city today, you can inspect similar maps for any neighborhood you like. Such lot maps are by law public records available to anyone who wants to look at them. He describes how shrewd developers who saw the city growing managed to get hold of a few farms on the outskirts of the city and to subdivide them into all these small lots, which they then sold at a nice profit to people who wanted to move out from the crowded central area of the city. The quality of these lots varied, with some low-lying areas that were very swampy and muddy, awkward places to try to build a home. So North Earls Court was a fine example from over 100 years ago of what we would call today a suburb. There was one other neighborhood a little to the north of this place, but apart from that it was on the very northern edge of the urban area. The people who moved there came out from the center of the city and for the most part traveled every day back out of the neighborhood to go to work. So it qualifies in every way as a suburb. According to Burgess's concentric zone model, the process of urban expansion should have filtered the flow of people coming out to this new suburb so that they would fit the description of the residential zone or perhaps the zone of commuters with a higher level of social class than found in a zone of working men's homes, for example, further toward the center. So what social class composition do we actually find in North Earls Court? Does it fit the stereotypical description of suburbs suggested by other writers we have considered? Does it fit the concentric zone model of Ernest Burgess? And as long as we're talking about Ernest Burgess, what role does ethnicity play in the sorting out process for the population of Toronto, as shown to us by the people who came to live in this new suburban neighborhood? The first remarkable insight that Harris finds in his historical evidence has to do with the question of social class. Since North Earls Court took shape at the outer edge of the city, the concentric zone model would suggest that we should expect, at the very least, to see well-established middle-class people moving out to the suburban neighborhood in pursuit of the Canadian dream, the equivalent of the middle-class suburban American dream described by many other scholars. But instead, Harris discovers that the families who bought these lots and came to live on the edge of the city were solidly blue-collar workers. Although most of his evidence is very personal, including names, pictures, personal letters, signed contracts, and the like, he does give us a few statistics from the official records of Toronto at the time. The first table of such statistics shows us the occupations listed for the household heads in North Earls Court at 3 successive dates in the first third of the 20th century. Throughout this whole period, the number of professionals, managers, and even white-collar clerical workers remained vanishingly small in the neighborhood, always in single digits. These are the kinds of people we might conventionally expect to show up in a suburb. Instead, almost all the occupations listed were for blue-collar workers, people in the construction trades like carpenters and bricklayers, plumbers and electricians and factory workers, both skilled and unskilled. It is in effect an area of working men's homes in a part of the city where Burgess would not tell us to look for them. It is a blue-collar suburb. Harris traces out some additional fascinating features of this neighborhood that follow directly from the blue-collar occupations of its residents. The stereotypical suburban neighborhood features new houses that require considerable financial resources for someone interested in buying them. This is one of the key factors that leads to the sorting out of the city by social class. and to the gradient of rising status with distance from the center that Burgess suggested. How then could these blue-collar workers manage to settle out on the edge of the city? They did not have a lot of money, and the terms of their employment often did not provide the kind of secure, stable futures that banks like to see before they start lending money for mortgages. This is where all those blue-collar skills came in handy, Harris tells us. These working men went off to work every morning, and when they came home at the end of the day, they often brought with them some bricks or some lumber or some other items that they had managed to gather up, and in the evenings and on weekends they all helped each other out with the various skills that they had to offer and pretty much built their own houses themselves. It took a lot longer to do things that way, but in the end they were able to build these houses for just a small fraction of what a middle-class white-collar worker with very different skills would have had to spend to get a house in the suburbs. Apparently, where there was a will, there was a way. So, if the residents of North Earl's Court were able to work together and build their very own blue-collar suburb out at the edge of the city, does this mean that there was no segregation by social class in Toronto? Were all the suburbs out at the edge of the city a mix of all kinds of people? The other dimension of urban segregation we have already considered had to do with ethnicity. Toronto also not segregated by ethnicity? Harris' answer to this second question provides us with his second very interesting research result. He discovered that the people who settled in North Earl's Court were actually almost totally from one specific ethnic background. They were either immigrants or the children of immigrants arriving in Toronto from Great Britain, the mother country to which Canada was tightly bound by its status as a dominion in the British Commonwealth. These new immigrants were of the same ethnic stock as the original settlers of Toronto from its earliest days. Harris believes that this is why it was so easy for them to convince the speculators who were selling lots that they deserved to buy the land. This is why the banks were more ready to lend them money than they were to lend to other groups, although the blue-collar residents of North Earl's Court didn't need to borrow that much from them in the first place. They may have been blue-collar workers, and so rather surprising residents to find out in this suburban area, but they differed from many of the other blue-collar workers in Toronto on this ethnic dimension. It looks as though their British origins got them a kind of free pass out of the central city area and a ticket to try their luck in their little blue-collar suburb. So where were all the other blue-collar workers and immigrants, the ones who came to Toronto from other parts of the globe? This time the answer is pretty much what you would expect if you're familiar with Burgess and his concentric zones. The blue-collar workers from Italy or Ireland or Poland or Germany found themselves closer in, near the old central districts of Toronto, in what certainly qualified as a classic zone in transition. There we find crowded neighborhoods, crowded and aging housing, an area so fragile that it was in fact devastated by a huge fire in 1906 that destroyed parts of downtown Toronto. These blue-collar workers and immigrants had to deal with all the familiar problems of urban life: sanitation, transportation, noise, crowding, and all the rest. So Harris has some mixed results for us here in terms of fitting this little Toronto neighborhood into the abstract model of concentric zones. As working men, these blue-collar workers are too far out in the wrong zone. But as part of the dominant British ethnic majority, they're in the right zone, out beyond all those strange other people from other places who could not follow them out to North Earl's Court. This mentions that other neighborhoods like North Earl's Court, where blue-collar workers managed to put together their own houses out on the edge of the Toronto urban area, appeared at other places around the city's periphery. As the opening paragraph of his article reminds us, prosperous middle-class people living in the city referred to these blue-collar suburbs as shack towns, with a mixture of condescension and grudging respect. One pattern we might try to fit to this history might be the older pre-industrial pattern of poor people on the outskirts of a city and elites in the middle, a kind of reverse image of Burgess's concentric zones. This same kind of image might also help us make sense out of some contemporary third world cities with their vast rings of shanty towns around their outer edges. But this model really doesn't fit any better than the original concentric zone model in Toronto. After all, Harris tells us that there were also a lot of blue-collar workers and their families living in the center of Toronto. There were also some more exclusive areas on the outskirts of the city, areas that looked more like the stereotypical image of suburbs drawn for us by writers in the mid-20th century. To give up and conclude that sometimes we just can't find any abstract model for describing the layout of a city. But that conclusion would be premature. We've already seen a rather different way to slice the urban pie, so to speak, in the urban sector model proposed by Homer Hoyt. Where Burgess was concerned chiefly with the residential patterns of people, Hoyt was more interested in the issue of transportation and how that gave structure to a city. He also had a model with a central business district in the middle, but he drew attention mainly to the transportation arteries that run out from this center, out through the city to connect with other cities in the larger economic system of an urban society. Transportation sectors quite plainly if we look again at Harris's map of Toronto. For example, there's a major rail corridor running out of the city to the northwest, and we can also see that major manufacturing firms, warehouses, and other components of a growing industrial city concentrated along this rail corridor to facilitate handling of both raw materials and finished goods. We might also notice another similar rail corridor running eastward from the city center along the north shore of Lake Ontario. As soon as we shift from Burgess's concentric rings idea to these wedge-shaped slices or sectors suggested by Hoyt, everything quickly falls into place for Toronto. The little blue-collar suburb studied by Harris appears squarely in the middle of the adjacent wedge, just to the east of the rail corridor. In Hoyt's model, this pie-shaped wedge is the place to look for the zone of working men's homes. They might have been able to build their own homes, but they certainly couldn't build their own cars. That kind of production doesn't scale down well from a factory to a backyard. So most of these blue-collar workers had no cars. Harris tells us that they walked to work. Many of them probably walked to work in the factories and other businesses located in the northwestern rail corridor out of the city, right next to their own wedge of the pie. It is also reasonable to guess that there might have been another such blue-collar suburb on the other western side of this transportation corridor, and perhaps one just to the north of the rail lines leading east out of the city. To clinch the usefulness of Hoyt's sector model in this case of Toronto, we only have to look a little further at the next wedge of the pie to the east of the zone of working men's homes. Sure enough, Yonge Street turns out to be the more fashionable, middle-class main artery running north out of the center of the city. As Hoyt suggested, it is as far away as it can get from the main industrial and transportation arteries leading out of Toronto. It would be hard to find a clearer case that fits this pie-shaped urban sector theory of city structure. If we take both the concentric zones of Ernest Burgess and the pie-shaped sectors of Homer Hoyt, we have an interlocking template that allows us to make sense out of almost any city, providing, that is, that the city actually has some kind of historical center, a core that concentrated the main economic interests and activities of the urban population. It turns out that our blue-collar suburb, Earl's Court, does fit into some of the very abstract models suggested by the urban ecologists, but this historical account still seems a little exotic and unlikely to us compared to the kind of suburbs we're familiar with at the start of another century. In some respects, Harris' account of how this blue-collar suburb was created sounds like a bygone age, a history that could never be repeated today. Could blue-collar workers go out into the suburbs today and cobble together their own houses, bartering different skills and working on the weekends? Although this kind of thing still may be happening somewhere out in the unincorporated outskirts of cities today, many things about the process of urban expansion have changed in 100 years. In most suburban areas today, strict zoning codes are in force, requiring minimum lot sizes, minimum house sizes, and mandatory hookups to the urban network of water mains, sewer mains, and electric utility lines. Detailed building codes specify what kind of building materials can be used, how electrical wiring and plumbing has to be installed, and even things like how high the steps in a staircase can be, and how foundations, roofs, doors, and windows must be constructed. Building a house according to all these rules now requires all kinds of permits, and then inspections when the construction is done. It has become almost impossible to do such work on your own in your spare time with a few friends and neighbors. And this is no accident. All these codes and zoning ordinances and rules were created on the one hand to ensure the safety and quality of life of people who live in the resulting houses, but on the other hand, also to make sure that developers and builders could prosper and make good profits out of creating our modern suburbs. With all these rules requiring high standards, the more affluent middle-class suburb became a self-fulfilling prophecy and contributed to the eventual economic sorting out of cities more along the lines of Burgess's original concentric zones. Harris's account of the creation of North Earls Court also brings up a different aspect of urban theories. The whole Chicago school idea of urban anomie, of people getting lost in the lonely crowd of cities. Did this blue-collar suburb foster impersonal secondary relationships? Did it produce faceless standardization of life, alienation, and anomie? Quite to the contrary, we find references not only to people holding bees to help each other construct their homes, but people getting together spontaneously to help build schools, churches, libraries, parks, playgrounds, and other elements that clearly spell out the word community. North Earls Court plainly deserves the label of a neighborhood, if any place ever did. If this neighborhood did not generate urban anomie, did it perhaps represent some kind of urban subculture? This idea might find more traction in Harris's account. It may not be the kind of subculture that Claude Fisher had in mind, but there are many examples in many cities of blue-collar neighborhoods that generate a distinctive sense of identity for their residents, somewhat at odds with the predominant middle-class white-collar view of life. Every city with a history of textile mills, for example, can point to the nearby neighborhoods where the mill workers lived, proudly adopting the derogatory term of lint heads and wearing it as a badge of honor. In Toronto, too, there seems to have been a cultural as well as an economic boundary that set the shack towns apart from both middle-class residents of the city and from the blue-collar workers of other ethnicities packed into their city center neighborhoods. As with all such specific historical accounts, Harris gives us a lot to think about in counterpoint to the generalized abstractions suggested by scholars like Burgess or Hoyt.